dynamics of money, budgeting, managing a household, managing your personal finances, and such things. Now, that doesn't mean it's not spiritual. It is. It's very much spiritual, but I wanted to spend the first few weeks of our Sunday school series. I've done 4 lessons so far over 8 weeks. And then we showed one video, so now we're starting the 5th lesson, climate change and the coming economic revival. And when I say shift gears, again, it's not that what we're going to talk about now is not spiritual, but it does have some practical application that my objective here is to help you. If you're in trouble, many of you are very astute and very well disciplined at handling your finances. Others of you, with all due respect, have not got a single idea or clue on how to manage money and what to do with it, and therefore you are in trouble now, perhaps, or you are certainly headed toward trouble if you continue with the practices that you're currently indulging yourself in. Let's read the text. Somebody read it for us. Deuteronomy 8:18. Manny Hernandez is going to read it. And you've got it up and ready to go. You don't have it up, nor is it ready to go, but you're getting there. Deuteronomy 8:18. Okay, nothing's working. You've got to get mics working, got to get the scriptures ready. Somebody needs to expedite that. You got the verse ready to go? All right.
Swore to your fathers as it is this day.
All right, power to get wealth. So let's put that in a practical context, because some here are not headed toward power to get wealth. That refers to accumulating, building up, saving, having more. The way the culture functions today is they're not doing that, but they are getting themselves into far more debt and far more trouble and difficulty. There may even be some here, you're paying 29 or 32% on credit card debt. You can't get wealth when you're doing that. If you're paying very high interest, even on a mortgage or an automobile, you are not getting wealth. Your automobile is deteriorating as you're paying on it. Some of you, most everyone who buys a new car, not most everyone, but a lot of people who buy a new car or a late model car end up getting what's upside down, where you owe more. If you sold the car, you couldn't get enough to pay your loan off. That's being upside down. That is not power to get wealth. Power to get wealth means that you're accumulating, you're building your assets, and you're acquiring more. There's nothing wrong with that. God put that dimension into nature. A farmer plants seed, gets more. A herdsman puts a herd of male and female together and gets more. A merchant buys product and sells it and gets more. God intended us to be an asset acquiring people. But what people are doing today is they're acquiring debt. There are people with zero asset or minus asset. Young couples today have to have a new house, new furnishings, and a brand new car. If you do that, you've got no assets. You're not getting wealth. This is not power to get wealth. What you have is a lot of debt. And so we're going to talk about that today. And I want to preface what I'm going to talk about by saying that I am not a financial advisor. If the result of this Sunday school is that You need help. You can come and talk to me, but as far as detailed financial advice, that's not my calling. There are men in this church, brothers in the church, who are not necessarily trained financial advisors that may be able to provide you with some advice. Or you can go to a professional type. So I want to just preface my comments. I don't know all about the various different means of preparing for retirement, for example, or even the best course that you should take and so forth. So I don't want those types of questions here that would be for someone who's a financial advisor. And like I said, there are men here who have some success in their business life, in their career, in their management of money, and I'm sure they'd be happy to help to the degree that they're able to. So I want to preface that. My job here today is to give you principles that you can work from. I want to give you a book that you can get. I guess we'll order these in the bookstore, but you can get it on your own. This book is freaking me out, to be honest with you, as I am reading it. It's called Borrow. Let me see if I can. Louis Hyman is the author. Louis, L-O-U-I-S-H-Y-M-A-N. Louis Hyman. Borrow is the name of the book, and it gives an incredible history of how we got from where we were to where we are today. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about this morning. And I want to take a little bit of a different approach with you in this Sunday school. I'm going to fold some biblical principles with some stories and some wisdom from my dad, my father. My dad was born in a different era. And when I say a different era, I mean it's like night and day. The reference points that you have today didn't exist for him and his family. We're going to get some of the basic fundamental principles because it just so happened that a lot of the ways that my father was raised in the era that he was raised, born in 1916, raised in the 20s and 30s during the Depression, went through World War II, and so forth. The principles, the way he thought about money was very biblical, even though he had no biblical Sunday school training. It was just the natural cultural way that men in those days, men and women in those days, thought about money. Pastor Mitchell's the same way. He was born in 1929, and they have very similar viewpoints about money, wealth, and resources. So again, we're going to talk about some very practical elements that will lead, I believe, to a successful financial life for you as a single person, or if you're a family or a single mother. There's always exceptions to everything, but the basic principles are true, and if you assign yourself to those basic principles, you can have financial blessing and financial solvency. And again, the objective with what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks is to help you avoid trouble. And if you are in trouble, it'll hopefully provide you with a way out from underneath sometimes what seems to be insurmountable debt. People rack up today. It's not uncommon to have 20, 50. I spoke with someone some years ago, $90,000 in credit card debt. Some of it was personal, some business, and much of it was high interest. He could not foresee ever being able to climb out from underneath the weight and the burden of that. It was ruining his life and his marriage and his relationships. And so the objective, and this really, I mean, it's for everybody, but I really want to target young couples that are here especially. And if there are young couples that should be here who are not, you better talk to them about coming. I won't do this, but there's a frustration that pastors have, and that is people who don't come to Sunday school, don't come to church, then they'll come for counseling, and I just taught or preached on what would have delivered and helped them, and so now I got to repeat it all to them. I do that because I love everybody, and I'm warm and welcoming if you have a problem. But Pastor Warner used to say, if you'll be in every service, 90% of your problems will be addressed. And so I really encourage you to get some young people, everyone who may not be here, into the Sunday school. So here's what we're going to start talking about today. I want to talk about two basic issues concerning money, and then I'm going to make two statements, and then I'll spend some time qualifying those statements. I want to talk to you today about borrowing and saving. Borrowing and saving. If you go to a restaurant and use a credit card, you are taking out a loan to pay for your meal if you use a credit card. So you're borrowing in ways you don't even think about it as borrowing. So I want to talk about borrowing and saving. Borrowing, from a biblical standpoint, has an immoral component to it. Not all borrowing is immoral, but some is. It's immoral because of the attitude of the one who's lending you the money. They're taking advantage, and the willingness that you have to put yourself in a position where literally you're owned. There's a moral component to borrowing. So here are the two statements that I want to begin with. You can write these down. You can memorize them. They're not complex. They're common sense. Number one, you cannot spend more than you take in. Most of you, it may be safe to say, could be doing that. You've got to get your life disciplined to the point where you can't be free financially, solvent financially. You can't be the definition of that verse, the Lord's given you power to get wealth, if you're spending more than you are taking in. Whatever that requires, whatever that demands of you, whatever lifestyle choices you have to make, whatever you have to restrain yourself from doing or experiencing, you cannot spend more than you take in. And we live in a culture, my dad's generation, they couldn't do that. They couldn't. Today you can. The whole society is structured so that you can spend more than you take in. Number two statement that we're going to discuss, no matter what you earn, you can always save. No matter what you earn, you can always save. Now, you might say, Pastor, how can you say that? You don't know my situation. We're barely squeaking by. Well, most everyone, and you would be the exception if you don't, most everyone here is wasting and squandering some amount of your money on things you don't need, shouldn't have, aren't necessary. Stop wasting, start saving. My dad's generation saved. My dad saved money his entire life. Saving meant you put money away, you don't touch it. Obviously, if there's emergencies and so forth, there may be some necessity, but it's the discipline of being able to put money aside for the future and not touch it and use the rest for what your needs are. So let's discuss these, and I'm going to talk about them in somewhat general terms, and we'll open it up for questions you may have. My dad, for his entire life, had an aversion to borrowing and a discipline to save. Those were ingrained in him. Today, those two things are not present in the culture. People will borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow and put things on time payment and get underneath the mountain of interest payments without any conscience of it. I shared with you the other day that my dad never paid a dime of interest on a credit card his whole life. He couldn't handle it. One time, he told me him and my mom went into a department store. They had to buy a washer and a dryer, and so the salesmen then were geared toward trying to get everybody to put them on time payments. And so my dad said they talked him into putting him on time payments, and he went home, he wrote out a few checks over the next year, and he couldn't handle it anymore, and he paid it off. There was something in him. He didn't borrow. Paying interest to him was flushing money away. He couldn't reconcile, why should I pay interest when it's not necessary? If he had to buy something and he couldn't afford it, he would save. He had 2 or 3 different savings accounts, retirement, emergency, and things that they were saving for, and he would funnel money, and he would wait, and he would put money away, and then he would buy something. He had an aversion to borrowing and a discipline to save. And again, these two principles really framed and shaped his whole financial life. My dad was retired for 25 years before he and my mom passed away. If you remember, they passed away in 2007. My dad retired at 65, passed away on the eve of his 91st birthday, and during his working life, he saved enough to live very, very comfortably, paid cash for a house that he bought in Tucson, sold that, bought a house here, wrote out a check for it, and he was able to, he didn't make a supernatural amount of money. He was a wage earner his entire life, but he was disciplined. He knew how to restrain himself. He never became jealous with what other people bought or had. Let's get a couple of scriptures that kind of underscore some of these matters. Proverbs 13:22. I want to just read the first part of it that pertains. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. A good man does that. So that implies good financial management, the acquiring and the accumulating of assets during the course of his life, so that when he passes away, not only does he have something to leave to his children, but he has enough to leave to his children's children. A lifetime of discipline and not borrowing and saving will produce a good, healthy asset that can be your legacy to leave behind. Again, Proverbs 19:14 underscores that statement. Houses and riches are an inheritance from fathers. So again, it implies that somebody has been wise, a good steward. They're not owned by the lender, but they're solvent. They've been able to take an amount and multiply it into a greater amount, and it implies a discipline that prepares for the future, not just the future of the individual, but the future of his children and his children's children. Now, you can save, if we're going to stay with the subject of saving for a moment, you can save for a variety of reasons, as my dad did. You can save to give. I think in the run-up to our conference, it'd be a good idea for every member of our congregation to open up a savings account and put a certain percentage aside, 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%, something that you're going to set aside, let's just say year-round, or let's just say from September, 6 months before conference, I'm going to save money, I'm going to put it aside, and I'm going to put some of it in the regular offerings, I'm going to put some of it in the world evangelism offering. You'd be amazed at how much you can accumulate. But you have to have the discipline not to touch it. So you can save to give, you can save to purchase. setting money aside instead of borrowing, paying an interest rate, and there's a trick involved. If you hear 0% interest buying furniture, but if you're a day late or a week late, all of a sudden you've got a 12% or a 22% or a 29% interest rate you got to pay. It's all in the fine print. You get a credit card for 6% interest or 8%, but if you're late on one payment, it skyrockets. So you can save for different reasons. You can save to give, save to purchase, save for a rainy day, an emergency that may come up, or save for the future. But again, this is a discipline. We're living in a culture that doesn't do this. I'll give some statistics about this in just a moment, but we're living in a culture that does not do this. It's not the habit of very many people anymore. In fact, the majority of American working people do not save at all, or save very little. Here's a few statistics about savings. More than half of households have less than 1 month's worth of income in a readily available savings account, far from the 6-month emergency fund many experts recommend. Now, that may not be realistic. 6 months, that's half a year's wages in a savings account. For the majority of working people here, that's not really practical. It can be a goal, certainly, and it can be done if you discipline yourself over time. More than half of households have less than 1 month's salary. Almost 30% of working people today have no savings whatsoever. And 62%, which includes that 30%, have less than $1,000. So $0 to $1,000 saved for 62%. I read an article called the heading of the article was 63% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $500 emergency. 63%, $500 emergency. I mean, that could happen once or twice a year. Washer, dryer, automobile repair. I mean, almost anything can happen. Medical emergency. Almost anything can happen. A $500 emergency is not, at least in theory, it's not that huge of an emergency, but 63% of Americans don't have enough savings in order to handle a $500 emergency. So if you're one of those, the 63% that has 0 saved to 1,000 saved, you should make this a goal of your budgeting in your life. Open a savings account, even if you're putting $5 a week. I don't care what it is. You've got to establish the discipline of saving. You should make it a goal. Save your first $1,000. Make that a goal. That over the next 6 months, or over the next 3 months, or over the next year, I'm going to end up with $1,000 in a savings account. And again, you save for a lot of different reasons, and you've got to, keep yourself from buying the latest gadgets and dipping into it at every whim. But this is a necessary, sometimes I feel like I'm speaking a foreign language. But anyway, this is a necessary discipline. All right, so borrowing. Let's talk about borrowing. And I'm going to get much more into this next week. This book is really scary. The position that people are putting themselves in for life. Many young people today, by the time you're 25, your financial life is pretty much set because of the level of debt you're underneath. Power to get wealth is not going to apply to you because all you're going to be able to do is throw money at various debts that you've accumulated in your life. Do you know that up until 1920, borrowing on a personal level was illegal? Institutions could not loan money on a personal level. 1920. So when my dad was born in 1916, there was nowhere to go to get a loan. If you were a business, you could get a loan. You could get a loan if you were a farmer to buy seed. If you were a merchant, you could get a loan to buy product because the bank could see there's asset there, there's potential there, there's possibility there. But there was something immoral about the idea of borrowing. This is the culture that my dad was raised in that survived him. He never acquiesced to what people acquiesce to today, the using of illegitimate means of credit to increase lifestyle. The whole idea of borrowing money to live beyond your means was not part of how things functioned and how things operated. Again, I want to restate this. Up until 1920, so that's less than 100 years ago, the kind of borrowing that's done today by most of us, it was not legal. There was no such thing as going to the bank and saying, hey, listen, I need this, I need that, I need to borrow $10,000 or $5,000 or $1,000. An institution couldn't do that. Laws were in place that prevented them from doing that. Loans were only for business. So two things changed that. Think about what happened in 1920. What was going on in 1920 that might have changed that? Does anybody have an idea? What shifted everything where borrowing on a personal level started to become common? Does anybody have an idea of, there were two dynamics that converged that shifted everything? All right, one of them was the automobile. Automobiles by 1920 were starting to be mass produced. The problem was nobody could afford them. The other feature in that time that was happening was obviously industrialization. Factories were producing goods that were being invented on a massive scale. And so along with the automobile coming available now, people were earning a weekly paycheck, which hadn't happened before. In all the centuries of life before, most people's income was very erratic. There were, a few months where you earned money and then maybe several where you didn't, and it was very erratic, so there was no confidence in lending money on a personal level, aside from the fact that it was illegal. But now, with industrialization, steady jobs, and weekly paychecks coming in, then the whole idea of credit started to emerge, and laws started changing in 1920 to allow people to buy an item they didn't have the money for, but they essentially borrowed or made payments on time. And then, of course, things like air conditioning. People had to have air conditioning, and they couldn't afford it, so they would get it on a loan. And then washers and dryers and other kind of high-priced items that most working-class people, refrigerators, most working-class people didn't have the bulk of money to pay for cash. And so the companies, whether it was the bank itself or the manufacturers, which was the case with the automobile, would simply give you the car, and you made weekly payments because they had confidence, you had a job, you had a weekly paycheck. So everything starts shifting. And this started changing laws, started changing mentality. Now a family that didn't have a huge income, couldn't afford to go pay cash for a car, washer, dryer. Now they can have all of these items because of the introduction of credit. At a lower wage, you could now live a lifestyle essentially beyond your means. You could have, what we call luxuries that you could never have afforded on your own. And so this obviously has gotten out of hand to the point, and I'm sure there may even be people here that know more than I do about the whole credit industry, the credit card industry, but it is one of the largest industries, if not the largest industry in the world, managing people's debt and benefiting through interest payments from that. Credit card companies and, automobile manufacturers, all of them have their own lending institution as part of their, part of how they do business and how they operate. Ford and GMC and all of these car companies have their own lending institution so that they can, you can get things beyond your ability. So let's get a couple of scriptures. Proverbs 22:7 the rich rules over the poor. Not a good thing. And the borrower is servant to the lender. Not a good thing. In some cases, there are legitimate debts, mortgages on houses, and perhaps automobile loans, but it still puts an institution over you. The borrower is servant to the lender, and you are. Deuteronomy 5:6. For the Lord your God will bless you just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you. And then Deuteronomy 28:12. Are you getting these scriptures up? Deuteronomy 28:12. The Lord will open to you his good treasure, the heavens, to give the rain to your land in its season and to bless all the work of your hand. You shall lend, but you shall not borrow. So it's putting borrowing not in a good light here. Not a good thing. So much of our borrowing and our debt is foolishness. It's extremely unwise. It's robbing you of a level of freedom in your life. It's robbing the church. Think if all the unnecessary interest payments that we're making would go to the work of God. I mean, what difference would it make? You're giving it to a lending institution. You're not disciplining yourself with how you spend money. You think because so-and-so can afford to eat out that you should be able to because you got a credit card. There are people, I have a relative, she got credit cards over the first few years of her adulthood, $5,000 limit. Within 2 weeks, it was spent. They had no control. She acted as though that was her money. And to this day, 10, 12 years later, she's still paying on those debts. Nehemiah 5, I didn't, you don't have to put it up. I didn't put it as a scripture to go up, but you read that chapter. Nehemiah chapter 5, and it's talking about the loaning industry that was at work in Jerusalem there, and it's referred to as an immoral industry, that there were people who had money, Jews who had money, and there were those who didn't, and they would loan them money, charge them exorbitant interest, and virtually own them, give them right and access to take them in as slaves if the demands were not met, and so forth. And you read that chapter, and it actually forbids a brother from loaning money to another brother and charging him interest. There's an immoral component to that in the context of the people of God. Now, we understand that a bank or the finance department of an automobile industry, they're going to charge interest. If you protect your credit rating, you can get low interest, minimal interest, and so forth, and you should work to do that. But it's viewed. You read it, the words. You look up in your concordance the words usury, the words borrow, the words lending, and you get a dimension in the Bible of an immoral component to this whole activity of loaning, charging interest, and putting people underneath unnecessary debt. It was considered wrong, immoral, to charge interest if someone had a need, and it was immoral if you couldn't pay your debt. Remember, in the Bible, if someone couldn't pay their debts, you could go into their house, take their belongings. You could even take the people, the sons, or other members of the family as slaves. You had that right. You had access to that, and even though that was culturally acceptable, it is not right. Something that should be avoided. You don't put yourself in that position unnecessarily. And as I thought about all of these matters and looking at the Bible and reading, and I couldn't help but think, like I have said, of my dad, who naturally had these impulses and these instincts, saved his entire life. 3 savings accounts for different purposes, discipline, never bounced a check, never paid interest on a credit card, never borrowed unnecessarily. I think he borrowed on his first house I was born in that house. He bought a second house in his first house he bought in about 1950, sold that one, bought another house with a mortgage in about 1957 or so, paid that mortgage off, and then from then on he was able to pay outright for the 3 other houses that he bought until he passed away. And so that's a consequence of discipline. And I'm telling you, avoiding debt, having money in savings produces, it's not the sole source of peace of mind and joy. We have a relationship with God, but as long as you have that in place, being financially solvent, not being in debt, not being underneath the weight of exorbitant interest rates, having a little money in savings, or a lot of money in savings is going to give you some peace of mind. You have money for emergencies. You have money to give. You can buy some of the luxuries that you may want, a newer vehicle, a bigger house, and so forth. But you've got to apply yourself to a level of discipline which this generation is not teaching. In fact, they're teaching the opposite. Use your credit card, borrow as much as you can. It's a total opposite, I think, of the biblical mandate that we read about and the way that my father was raised and the way that he thought about money. People in my dad's generation never flashed their wealth. If they had something that was useful, they didn't buy another one to replace it just because a new gadget came out. And my dad did not have a poverty mentality. I understand how a poverty mentality works. You can afford bigger, better, newer, nicer, but you just, I'm just a poor schmuck and I don't deserve it. I'm just going to wear clothes full of holes. My dad didn't do that, but he would, from the age of 5 until I was 21, my dad may have had some of the same clothes that he always wore. They didn't wear out. My mom made them. My mom learned how to be a seamstress in her teenage years, and all throughout her life, she made all of her own clothes. She made my dad's shirts, and to my chagrin, when I went to Catholic school and had to wear a uniform, my mom wouldn't buy a shirt. She would go down to the store that sold the shirt, look at it, and go home and make a pattern, and then I had to wear a shirt, and it was a little bit different than all the other kids' shirts, and I was embarrassed by that. Why can't you just buy me one? But that's just the way they lived, the way they thought, the way they functioned. And we lived in a nice home. I would say we were upper middle class. About every, 7, 8, 10 years or so, my dad would buy a new car. We had a 1961 white Galaxy 300, 1961. And then in about 68, I think, he bought another Galaxy 500. That was a Galaxy 300. Then he bought a Galaxy 500, and I think he went from 68 to about 1980. He bought another Ford, and then I think the last car that he bought was after he moved here. So during my life, he probably bought 5 new cars. They always started, they always worked, they were decent, nice, but that's just how he lived, and I wish that we would embrace some of that mentality. So let me open it up for questions. I'm sure some of you have some things you might be able to add to that. You may have some wisdom that I may have overlooked, but somebody with a question. Yes?
Hi, Pastor. I just wanted to add, you talked about a family member having $5,000 worth of credit card debt.
Yeah.
Something that we call the minimum payment trap is they allow you to only pay 2% on that, so it'd be $100 a month. If you have an interest rate anything over 18%, you'll never pay it off in your lifetime.
Yeah, we're going to get into all of those. I'm going to put some things up when we talk about that, but hold on to that because we have to really make that clear because people don't know what they're doing with their credit card. Angel.
Pastor, one of the things that when I first got saved and you wanted to preach the gospel, one of the things that it was kind of like something that was taught. It was wasn't a rule or anything, but they just kind of, hey, you need to be out of debt. You can't get in debt if you want to go preach, so that you're able to go and do that, and at that time I was sharing Friday night with some folks, is that there was this teaching people, hey, you live within your means, and you don't get into any kind of debt, especially vehicles, because vehicles just throwing money away, and now that the church has grown and has gotten a lot, we're very blessed. This is a great Sunday school, because there's young people here. They're seeing people that have worked 20 years, and now they're enjoying life. They're buying new cars. They're buying homes because they can afford them.
Yeah.
But these young people, they don't realize, I can't afford that, but they're buying new cars.
Yeah.
And they're getting themselves into a hole where they'll never be able to go preach because they're so in debt, and they're never above water. And, I'm glad, and we do need to push for these young people to come in to these Sunday school classes, because they don't get the concept of staying out of debt and living within your means.
And waiting. You have to wait for some things. I had a pioneer, I'll just share this with you. I had a pioneer pastor ask me about buying a house that would have increased his, what he was paying for rent by 30%. So it would have gone from $1,000 to $1,500. I said, no. Do you want to be a full-time pastor or not? When we send a pastor out, I don't want him living in a broken window, graffiti-ridden neighborhood, $450 studio apartment, rat-infested. They need to live in a decent place, nice area, but at the minimal cost that they can find. That's wisdom. Then what happens is you work a job, you pay your rent, you meet your needs. Then as the church grows and you stay at that level, you can eventually get off support and be a full-time pastor. But if you keep increasing your personal expenditures, you're never going to get off support. It's going to take you longer. So the question is, what do you want to do, and what do you want to be in life? If you want to be a full-time pastor, the answer is no. Don't buy a house now. You wait until your ministry provides you with the ability to do things like that. And again, that's not a poverty mentality, it's wisdom. Being frugal is not a poverty mentality. Exercising wisdom and restraint, just because you have the opportunity, but the bank's going to loan me the money that I need, or I could walk into a dealership and get the car that I want at 22 years old. Doesn't mean it's wise. George, over here. Quick, run, move.
Pastor, I have a question. What are your, standards or requirements for, let's say, a couple who wants to go and pioneer as far as their financial?
I don't want you to be in debt. You've got to work your way, prepare yourself, get yourself out of debt. If you have an automobile payment, I don't view that as unnecessary debt unless it's a $800 automobile payment. That would be ridiculous for a young couple to have something like that. Unnecessary debts, furniture payments, things you shouldn't be charging and getting and borrowing money for, and credit card debts of $5,000 to $10,000. Today, people carry a $5,000, $10,000 credit card without thinking twice about it. So those kind of things, unnecessary debt. Jonathan.
One more thing I want to add, Pastor, is that this has nothing to do with income. So there are many people that have very high income, very good jobs, great businesses, and yet I meet with them and their financial well-being is nowhere near as good as somebody who they just make the regular just wage earner, like you said, but they're disciplined and they save and they don't have debt. And the others think that, I make enough money, I can buy this, I can buy that, no problem. And like you said, carrying large amounts of debt without even thinking about it, because they figure, I make enough money that I can pay it off whenever I want. But you fall into that trap, and you get to to a point to where you're later on in life and you can't get out of it anymore.
Yeah.
So I just want to encourage everybody who it's not about, oh, it's because I just need to make more money. No, it's about the discipline in what you have.
Exactly right. You know, rich people on average have more financial problems. You can be at let's just say a $30,000 wage a year, live within your means, have enough to give, enough to save, a little bit to invest, have a few nice things, and be happy in life and have victory. We've got to stop. Save it for next week. Next week, what I'm going to do is I think we'll start with putting up a budget, and I'll make there's a lot of different ways that you can do it, and if some of you have a good printable budget, you can give it to me sometime this week or email it to me, but I've got one that I'll put up, and we'll make those available so that you can sit down and actually write out. It's very important that you write out income and what goes out and get a visual of what you're dealing with in your financial life. So we're going to finish there. Thank you for your attention, and we'll begin service in just a few minutes. Lord bless you this morning.
You made the world and saw that it was good. You sent your only son, for you are good.